Welcome back everybody to the third in our series of videos on the topic of disability. In this video I want to compare two very interesting ways of looking at disability, two models of disability, namely the medical and the social models of disability. Let's start in the past. What was it like to be disabled in past times? What do you think life was like for disabled people, say, 110 years ago? I'm being a little bit precise here, 110 years ago. I could say 100 years ago, but I'm saying 110 years ago. Where would these people have lived? What would they have done? And it's a lovely chance maybe for me to give you a film tip. I'd like to recommend The Lost Prince. Now, if you're interested in history, and if you're interested in a fascinating biography of a lost life, a lost story, so to say, so a hidden biography, it's the story of the learning disabled son of King George and Queen Mary. Of course, this boy's siblings would have been often publicly in view in various events, but the child was barely seen in society, and it's an absolutely cracking film, utterly recommendable, and I think the whole thing's actually on YouTube right now if you want to watch it after this talk. It's very long though, and you really have to be into history, but I find it beautiful filmmaking. Good, so what was life like 110 years ago? Press pause and natter with your partner. Well, I'm guessing that some of you might have come to the idea that life was quite different for disabled people in earlier historical phases. I alluded to this point a little bit when I described that film. The prince in this story was kept from public view. So he was effectively hidden from society for his whole life. It's actually that which makes the story so moving. And this was very much a trend at the time. After World War I ended, you would have visibly seen disabled people. Soldiers would have come back with visible physical disabilities. So the visibility of disability rose after World War I. But before World War I, disabled people were out of sight. And indeed, to some extent, they had been for a long time. It's maybe easiest to explain why using the ideas of this social philosopher. Do you recognize that face? I'm sure many of you guys have read this guy's ideas, read this guy's books. This is the French social philosopher Michel Foucault. And Foucault had fascinating ideas on how we treat, well, the other in society in a general sense. One of Foucault's earliest books was looking at the history of madness. The history of madness. How are people with mental health problems treated in earlier times? Now, it goes without saying, mental health problems and disability are two very related areas. So his findings, his analysis is a very interesting source of orientation to answer my question. So 110 years ago, what would my life have been like if I were disabled? Foucault has a concept. He notes around the mid-1600s in Europe, societies built large institutions for the treatment of people with mental health problems and disabilities. At first, the character of these institutions was something like a workhouse, Slowly over time, they kind of morphed into something like a hospital or something like a home. Okay, so the nature shifted gently, but the idea was a very, very large institution for the treatment of these people. And there were two purposes here. The treatment was, of course, meant to cure the people inside these institutions. The idea was to cure the mentally ill and the disabled. Of course, in many cases, they couldn't. Many of their therapies today we would see as being very, very, well, laughable, to be honest. So, but nevertheless, formally trying to cure the mentally ill. The other purpose was, of course, to lock people away, to confine, to lock up these people away from sight. And of course, that's why we call it the Great Confinement. You'll see evidence of this. I live in a city in Germany called Münster. On the edge of town, something like 10 kilometers out of town, is a large psychiatric hospital. And it was built, I'm guessing, around the same time that Germany was founded. It's got a Gründerzeit, a Bismarck period building. And it's wonderful, beautiful brick architecture. And it really is typical of that time. People who are disabled were very much encouraged to be locked away, to be out of sight. So the Great Confinement, a movement in Europe over several hundred years. Good. I want to move on now and think about how medicine, the medical practitioners who built these enormous hospitals, how they see disability. So we have a way of looking at disability, a medicalized view of disability. And I want to introduce you to a really interesting concept. In the literature, we talk about the medical model of disability to describe this medical way of looking. Also called the individual model, different word, same concept. The model describes the way in which a medical practitioner, a doctor, might see disability, the way they're seeing their medical gaze, so to say, their medical perspective. So my question for you to pause and think about with your partner, how does or how did a doctor see disability? Pause here. We can summarize how a doctor might see disability. Now, I'm not saying the following is true for your doctor, or your father who's a doctor, but I'm just generalizing how the profession itself has looked at disabled people. The root of a disability is, of course, an abnormality in the body. There's something organic behind the disability. This abnormality leads to the patient not being able to do certain things. This abnormality can be responded to medically with treatment, with therapy. We even have disciplines of medicine, rehabilitation science, for example, to help remove these abnormalities. The body in this perspective is therefore like a machine. You know, Foucault's concept on my previous slide, went back to 1600. And there's a kind of Renaissance Enlightenment idea here. This is, a time of using natural science to understand the body. The body is like a machine. A fully functioning machine is the goal. And the disabled person may well be seen as being somehow deficient, somehow lacking, defective, if you like. It's a negative way of looking at the disabled body. The disabled body is somehow lacking in this medical gaze. So this is a summary of what we call the medical model. This is a summary of how medicine has long looked at the disabled body. What do you think about this? What do you think about this medical model of disability? I think everybody's a little bit ambivalent here. Does it lead to any consequences in terms of how disabled people live, learn and work? What consequences does it have for their everyday lives? That leads to another question, pros and cons of this medical model of disability. Once again, pause here and natter with your partner. What can we say? My immediate instincts here are, this brings benefits, this brings disadvantages. For me, it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, I really must acknowledge how much medical science has actually alleviated disability and removed disability over the last 100 years, for example. And I'm thinking of, for example, the vaccinations that children have, diseases like polio, that's Kinderlähmung in German, polio, diseases like measles. We've almost gotten rid of them. Vaccinations are wonderful things. They've almost removed many of these conditions, many of these health problems. And if you are a disabled person, you'll, I'm sure, have benefited from rehabilitation science. There's various ways in which doctors can really help make your everyday life easier. So on the one hand, I acknowledge these wonderful specialist services making life easier. On the other hand, I said it's a double-edged sword. On the other hand, there is an ambivalence here. There seems to be something problematic about this medical gaze. In particular, it seems to locate the disability in the person. It seems to locate disability in the person. And the idea then is that I can do things with you. If you're a disabled person, maybe I can place you in some kind of specialist institution. And it's fascinating that in a country like Germany with very powerful medical practitioners, we also have other services supporting disabled people in a very specialized way. And our special school system in Germany is also quite distinct. I think it's no coincidence that the two belong together. So the idea of therapeutic and highly specialist services lead us to some great medical care, but possibly also a segregated education. And that's a point I'll return to later in my next video. Good. Hold on to that, let's move on. Early critical views of this model. This model has an incredibly long heritage, a long history. We've been thinking like this in medicine, for more than 100 years. Early critical views, I think you can really locate the movement, locate the change, locate the protest back to the 1960s. Okay, so going back something like 60 years, a growing criticism of the model developed. So there was a critical of this model, maybe in part of that whole protest movement, civil rights, human rights, gender rights. It was part of that whole set of protest movements back then in the 1960s. So we're looking much more critically at this medical way of seeing the disabled body. Critics accepted disabled people as being people with impairments. The impairment concept was okay. They weren't arguing with that. Do you guys remember this word impairment? We had it in my last video. I'm guessing it might have been new to you then. I remember showing you my socks, right? Oh, let me do it again, what the hell. So this is my sock on my right foot. And as you can see, it's my doggy socks. What sock do I have on my left foot? Can I get back on my chair? Very well, look at that, it's my left foot. My socks are the same. My socks are a pair, parity. This is a Latin word, I think, meaning the same. It's a Latin negative, and impairment is somehow not the same as something else. So critics, disabled people themselves, they noted they have impairments. A disabled person has an impairment. There is something in the body which is organically different. That bit was okay. But critics, again, many of whom were disabled, they argued that the cause of disabled people's difficulties was not the impairment itself, but rather society's disability-unfriendly structures. Out of these critical thoughts arose a new way of looking at disability. And this new way of looking at disability we call the social model of disability. Disabilities arise due to social barriers that people with impairments face. It's not the impairment that disables somebody. I'm not a person with a disability. I don't carry my disability with me. I have an impairment. I don't carry my disability with me. It's not the impairment that disables somebody, but rather those barriers in society. These barriers may be physical. Steps would be the classic example of a physical barrier, but the idea should be seen more generally, social and cultural barriers. My next task for you, you saw this coming, didn't you? What barriers do disabled people face? Again, with your partner, I want you to together make a list. Please note, make sure that as well as physical barriers, you include some social or cultural barriers as well. As well as focusing on physical disabilities, consider also learning difficulties. You mentioned that time in my last video, what Americans might call intellectual disabilities. Consider also sensory impairments. I gave you that word too, deafness, blindness as well. Make a list together with your partner. What points did you come up with? I'm guessing you'll have a number of mine and maybe some extra ones as well. I did this exercise myself and I came up with a huge table. Here's a selection. Obviously starting with the physical buildings and their contents. We've talked about steps, but the whole architecture of a building and also the interior design, the way in which a kitchen is arranged. There are ways of doing this well. And if you haven't heard the term, I really can recommend checking out the concept of universal design. Universal design, it's something really quite beautiful. So the lack of a universal design, the barriers within buildings. But again, something completely different now. This is a social thing here. Employment opportunities. Think about norms, customs, think about prejudice. There's no reason why, if you do a student job, maybe you're waitering, somebody with Down syndrome could often do that job just as well as you. There's actually no reason why not, except for the attitude of the employer. And if you are in a society with a high level of social inclusion, you'll actually see visibly disabled people working at the mainstream workplace rather than being, say, in a sheltered workshop. So think of the barrier of people's prejudices, people's false expectations of who people are before they meet them. Next point, schooling, segregation. The barrier of the special school system is what I'm going to touch upon in my next video. The idea of segregating out parts of your childhood school class cohort into a separate school. The barriers of special schooling. Care, support, help. Many disabled people rely on family support. That is politically seen a complete scandal. That shouldn't be like that. So that's a barrier in itself. Communication. As a non-native speaker, I'm quite sensitive to good German and bad German. When I started working at a German university, I was a little bit perplexed. I was expected to sign an employment contract which I couldn't read. It didn't really help for me to show it to a native speaker, because most native speakers said to me, oh, that's your ugly bureaucratic German. That's how German bureaucrats speak. So you can see that language itself is something that can be very enabling, but also very disabling. That can be added to our list of barriers. Free time, think about the idea of arranging free time if you have, say, physical mobility problems, you know, your transport problems, your transport costs, for example. Think about rights. What kind of entitlements do I have? Are my rights exactly the same as a non-disabled person? Do I have the rights to all of the services, all of the assistance I need to live like a non-disabled person? And finally, stigmatization. Maybe it's a bad example, but just the idea of interacting less. Disabled people often report that often people don't address them so often, they don't ask them the time, or they don't see them so often as non-disabled neighbours. So that's interesting how strangely disabled people may be stigmatized, or certainly feel that way in society. Now, this is a long list, we can make it even longer. That's the sobering point here. The range of barriers is something actually that you can see very well if you've worked with disabled people, or if you're disabled yourself. You'll learn to see these everywhere, and it's sobering stuff. So we live in a barrier-filled world. So these are ideas that evolve out of this social model of disability. I'm going to talk more about that in our last video coming up, and also tell you about this wonderful new discipline of disability studies. So hope you've enjoyed this video. Looking forward to the next one. Thanks, everyone.